Welcome to Fear and Greed's Sunday feature. I'm Sean Aylmer. With Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister, heading to Beijing this weekend, we thought it'd be a good time, to reprise an interview we did with Mike Smith, the China correspondent for the Australian Financial Review. Now, Mike was tasked with covering one of the most fascinating countries in the world at a time when tensions were high. As the relationship between China and Australia deteriorated, Mike received a midnight visit by the Chinese secret police to his house in Shanghai. In this interview, which he gave us back in 2021, Mike tells me about that night, the fear that he might be about to disappear, and the incredible few days that followed. He also gives us a bit of an insight about what living in Beijing is like. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Australia's relationship with China has been tense for some time. It's our major trading partner. And while demand for our iron ore continues to soar, China has slapped crippling tariffs on a range of other Australian exports from barley to wine. Then there's the political tension. That came after Australia took a stand on issues including the origins of COVID-19, disputes over the South China Sea, human rights abuses and foreign interference. The Chinese embassy here in Australia even went so far as to provide a list of grievances to the media. All of this made China a very unsafe place for an Australian journalist to be living and working. Michael Smith was the China correspondent for the Australian Financial Review. He was one of the last two Australian foreign correspondents in China before a late-night knock on the door led to his removal from the country. It's an incredible story and one that Michael has now turned into a book, The Last Correspondent. Mike, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thanks very much, Sean.
Tell me about that night. I've read the book, so I know, but listen, what an incredible story.
Oh, look, it was a pretty terrifying moment, I have to admit. You know, I'd been told by the Australian government to get out of China. We'd actually packed our bags, booked a flight the next day, went off to bed, and I was fast asleep, and there's sort of this banging at the door. I lived in this sort of very old laneway house in Shanghai, this big old wooden rickety house, and so the noise was reverberating up to the bedroom, staggered down in my boxer shorts and flung open the door, and there's sort of 6 uniformed police standing on my doorstep, and you know they had a camera and a spotlight and they're flashing their badges. So
what time of the night was this?
It was 12:30 a.m. So half an hour after midnight. And you know I think they did that on purpose to sort of try and intimidate and scare you. And look, frankly, it did work. They sort of came into my lounge room, sat me down on the couch and sort of surrounded me, and they read me out a 3-page document which said I was a person of interest in a national security investigation and that there was an exit ban on me, which meant I couldn't leave China. So this has never happened to a foreign journalist before. It was absolutely terrifying.
No. So in that moment where they're reading that 3-page document to you, which are you fluent in Chinese at all?
No, I can speak a little bit, but no, definitely. But they have a translator. So there was an official translator, a young woman standing there sort of relaying the whole thing in sort of in a very official tone.
So when you're sitting there in your pajamas, basically, what did you think was going to happen to you?
The thing was, I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't quite understand what was going on. And as they read this statement out to me, I had the sort of the darkest thoughts were flashing through my mind. I just thought, this is it. They're going to take me away after this. And an Australian Chinese journalist named Cheng Lei had been detained just a few weeks earlier. So you knew it wasn't outside the realm of possibility. So yeah, very, very scary moment sitting there thinking, this is it, I'm going to be disappeared.
So what happened next?
So they finished their sort of spiel, read out this statement and got me to sign it. And then they suddenly got up and walked out of the house. So at that moment, I sort of relaxed slightly. My partner speaks Mandarin and we both actually went outside and ran after them and started asking them, look, what's going on? We want to
hold on. So you ran after them. So these guys had knocked on your door at 12:30, come in, read the riot act. You're thinking, goodbye, Michael Smith. And then you chased them?
Kind of, yeah. We sort of followed them out and very politely asked for a copy of the statement because I didn't quite understand what had gone on. My partner's a bit more bolshy than I am and speaks Mandarin, so started asking a few questions. They wouldn't tell us anything. They just shoot us off. So went back inside. I rang Bill Birtles, the ABC correspondent in Beijing, who was in a similar situation to me, only to discover he'd had the exact same visit at the same time. up in Beijing where he was. So we knew it was a coordinated, very political campaign to target the only two journalists working for Australian media outlets left in the country.
And of course, a bunch of journalists, particularly from America, had been kicked out before you guys. So what happened after that?
Yeah, so quite a lot of American journalists had sort of been expelled from China, had their visas revoked. But, I wasn't overly worried until I got that visit, because I thought the worst thing that could happen to me was that I would be deported from China. But obviously I was wrong. So the next morning, things really accelerated. Obviously called the Australian Embassy that night and went into the consulate in Shanghai early the next morning. So the Australian consulate's in this sort of high-rise building. They just process visa applications there. And we had a fairly high-level meeting there with local diplomats and officials back in Australia, and they made this very, serious decision to put us into consular protection. And this doesn't happen very often, particularly with journalists. So I was bundled into a van, taken back to my house. They grabbed my suitcase and my partner, and then we drove to the Consul General's house in Shanghai, in the former French concession. So a big house, with a big secure gate around it. And that's where I was to stay for the next 4 days, sort of Julian Assange style.
Obviously, the Australian government took it extremely seriously if they're going to that sort of drastic action.
That's right. I mean, we're a bit shocked at this decision. I mean, this is a really serious decision to make. I think it probably went to the Prime Minister's office. And this, I've spoken to people since, and they said this has rarely happened to Australian citizens in China before. So I think the Australian government was very concerned about our safety, particularly given there were Cheng Lei, this other journalist, was detained, and the two Canadians had been detained in China 18 months earlier. And I mean, I remember asking them at the time, are we going too far here? Are we going to anger the local authorities? And they said to me, well, the downside risk is so great. Do you want to risk detention? And the old precedents of dealing with China are now out the window. So I think that they perhaps made this sort of wise decision to go down that path.
And how did you get out in the end?
So we were in there for 4 days, and during this time there were some very high-level negotiations going on between the Australian government and China's Ministry of State Security, which is its very powerful sort of security agency. And, we were very nervous. We didn't know if we were going to get out or not. And I guess you've got to give the Australian government some credit. At least there are enough diplomatic channels open at that time to actually do this deal. So in the end, China agreed that we could leave the country, but we had to submit to an interview with the Ministry of State Security in relation to this national security case that they thought we had some information we could share. And that case was, of course, the detention of this journalist Cheng Lei. But the whole thing was a bit farcical. I didn't know Cheng Lei. I'd met her once. I really had sort of nothing to really offer them. But I think to save face, we had to go in and be part of their security investigation to sort of uphold its legitimacy before they'd let us leave the country.
Stay with me, Michael. We'll be back in a moment. My guest this morning is Michael Smith, author of The Last Correspondent. So in all the time you'd had in China before that, and it was about 2.5 years, is that right, Mike?
A bit over 2.5, yeah.
Had anything like that happened before?
Absolutely not. And, I need to emphasize that I had a really terrific time in China. It's a fascinating country, great place to work as a journalist because the stories are so interesting. And, I think being a journalist in China, there is sort of a low-level form of harassment that goes on. You assume your phone's bugged, things like that. But I always felt safe. I never felt unsafe, and I always thought, as I said before, the worst thing that could happen to me is I'll be deported. So, I've travelled around the country. I've been followed at times by undercover officials. I've been stuck in a police station a few times and been questioned because we were taking photos somewhere where we shouldn't have been. But nothing like this had ever happened before.
Is it a country that, we read so much about China, which is sort of scary, Big Brother-esque. Is it like that in reality, or is everyday life not that different to living in Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked me that, because I think, a lot of the reporting we get in Australia about China is sort of very negative. So you sort of conjure up this image of this sort of very sinister dark place. And look, it really can be at times. But when you're on the streets of Shanghai or Beijing, I mean, they're massive commercial cities. There's a lot of money floating around. Everyone's going about their business, and they're pretty much like us. They're just trying to get their kids through school, trying to buy a house, trying to get a job. And, life in bustling Shanghai is actually quite a lot of fun. There's a lot going on, and it's really diverse and interesting country. So day to day, life is actually pretty normal. People on the whole they've got challenges, but they're fairly happy. They're a lot wealthier than they were sort of 10 or 20 years ago. So, but I think dig beneath the surface, there is some anxiety. There's a lot of restrictions on free speech. Certainly if you're sort of a political kind of person, you have to really watch your step, and the place is becoming more authoritarian, particularly, in the last couple of years under Xi Jinping.
Okay, now you were there during the Trump era where Washington and Beijing were basically at odds the whole time, and well, they started off okay. Xi Jinping and Donald Trump seemed to get on very well for that first meeting, and that lasted about 24 hours, and then off they went. What was it like being in China? What's the attitude towards the US at the moment?
Yeah, the Trump era was really interesting. So I was there when, the US-China trade war sort of really kicked off. There was a lot of pressure on China, and Australia was sort of really out of the picture then. We weren't drawn into that trade war at all, although there were sort of different tensions playing out in relation to sort of foreign interference concerns back in Australia. And I think you did see this. I mean, I think most Chinese people saw Trump as, like we do, as being a bit of a lunatic. And I think, the perception in China was that the US was pushing back on China purely because it wasn't happy that it was a rising power and becoming sort of economically stronger. So that was quite interesting. And then, things really shifted during the pandemic. I mean, the US was a complete mess, and all the propaganda and the media footage in China was, it was just all the crazy stuff Trump was doing and saying, and the race riots and, the COVID outbreaks. So people had sort of this really negative view of the US.
Well, they had a fair bit of material to play with.
They did. And it plays into the Communist Party sort of argument that, well, democracy is a bit broken and our system perhaps works better.
You also, I mean, the great thing about being a foreign correspondent is you're allowed to do all sorts of stuff that you probably can't do when you're sitting back in the office in Melbourne or Sydney. You met Jack Ma, who I think is one of the most incredible individuals ever. He's the founder of Alibaba, a man who at one point was probably the richest Chinese person, though has had an incredible fall from grace over the last 6 months or so. First, how'd you get the interview, and I mean, what was he like?
Yeah, look, I mean, I was very lucky to get that interview. He doesn't do a lot of interviews with the Western media, and frankly, when I requested the interview, I was a bit shocked when he said yes. And I think it's partly, he does have this sort of great affection for Australia. He met, when he was quite young as a teenager, he met this Australian family, the Morley family, back in his hometown in China, and they eventually brought him over to Australia. I think he was in his early 20s, and he spent some time in Newcastle, and it's sort of, really, his experience in Australia, had a really big impact on him. So he does speak quite fondly of Australia. And
hold on, I've got to jump in here. His image of Australia is Newcastle in New South Wales in the 1980s. That's a pretty rough town.
That's right. I mean, I think he probably visited Sydney and went out on the harbour and stuff. But
I hope so.
Yeah, that was his this is when he was, back before he built his sort of e-commerce empire.
So what happened to him? Why did he, we sort of read about the fact that, the ant float was pulled, and it just sounds like the Chinese authorities just didn't like the power he had. Is that what it boils down to?
Yeah, no, I think it says a lot about where China's heading. So when I interviewed Ma in 2018, he was the poster child for entrepreneurism in China. He was a household name. He was really celebrated figure. And then, within a couple of years later, he's completely on the nose. They pulled the float of, his financial services spin-off rather dramatically. Then he disappeared for 3 months late last year, and now it looks like he's going to be forced to sell his stake in Alibaba, and he really fell foul of the authorities. He was quite outspoken. He was quite critical in a speech last November about, how the banking system's regulated in China, and people say, well, that was just one step too far. He sort of annoyed Xi Jinping, and now he's completely on the nose. But it's also a reflection of, we've seen a lot more state control over the private sector in the last year or two. And I think it's just getting, much harder for these entrepreneurs in China now.
We'll be back with more in a moment. I'm talking to Mike Smith, China correspondent for the Australian Financial Review and author of The Last Correspondent. We write and speak and talk a lot about China. Does Australia hit the radar when you're in China?
Not really. I mean, most Chinese people I meet had a lot of affection for Australia. A lot of them either have children studying here or they know someone studying here. So a lot of them have actually been here and they go, oh, wow, you guys have got great beaches and great food. And towards the end of my time there, people were a bit more critical of Australia. But I think we overstayed our importance here. I mean, I think, on the world stage, we are seen as being reasonably insignificant in Beijing's mind. So I think they get quite annoyed when we're quite outspoken and we're lecturing them on human rights and how to run their country. So I think they sort of maybe perceive us as being a bit of an annoyance at the moment.
Yeah. But I mean, of course, China is in dispute with not just Australia, but lots of countries, US, EU, certainly others in the region.
That's right. And look, even you talk to sort of experienced China watchers and everyone's a bit confused about, what Xi Jinping's up to. I mean, he's sort of picking fights with everyone, the US, Canada, India, Europe and us. So you name it. So they've emerged from this pandemic. They're very confident, very emboldened. And I think we're going to see more pushback. And unfortunately, poor old Australia's got a bit caught in the crossfire. We're a pretty easy target. We're so economically reliant on China and they really have decided to pick on us.
Except they still like our iron ore.
They do. Seems to be one safe commodity for now anyway.
Mike, thanks for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me.
That was Michael Smith, China correspondent for the Australian Financial Review and the author of The Last Correspondent. Go and read it. Mike is a great writer and it is a cracking read. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join me every weekday morning for the full Fear and Greed podcast with all your business news. I'm Sean Aylmer. Have a good day.